Good evening. I'm Milani, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at the University of South Florida. I welcome you to this fifth virtual conversation we've had. I'm going to make a very brief announcement because I want to take advantage of our guests and exploit them as much as I possibly can. If you're interested in watching our previous programs, and we have 5 of them, please go to YouTube and check with CSDS YouTube or put Milani when you go to YouTube. You should be able to find those previous 5 conversations we've had. With that said, let me introduce the Dean of our College of Arts and Sciences, my boss, who is going to introduce our distinguished guest. Dean Eric Eisenberg is Professor of Communication, and since 2007 has served as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at our university. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Rutgers University in 1977 and received his PhD in Organizational Communication from Michigan State University in 1982. Dr. Eisenberg twice received the National Communication Association Award for the outstanding research publication in organizational communication. Professor Eisenberg is also the author of more than 70 articles, chapters, and book. He is the dean of the largest college at the University of South Florida, which is one of the largest public universities in this country. In his college, under his leadership, we have nearly 600 full-time faculty, 18,000 students, and a budget of nearly $100 million. For the past 2 years, I've tried my best to get a raise from him because I know what kind of budget he has, and I have failed. In many ways, our college is larger than most universities. In addition, Dr. Eisenberg has played a major role in our university's strategic efforts to improve student success. Please join us in welcoming Dean Eisenberg, who will deliver the introductory remarks and introduce our very distinguished guest. Dr. Eisenberg.
Well, thank you, Dr. Milani, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the University of South Florida and the College of Arts and Sciences, I welcome all of you to this evening's conversation about the domestic and global challenges the new U.S. administration will face in 2021 and beyond. Part of the mission of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies is to inform and educate our students and our community about the nuances and complexities of international affairs. The center has made impressive achievements in realizing this important mission. As you all know all too well, we are today experiencing the single worst public health crisis of the last century. Nearly 250,000 Americans have fallen victim to COVID-19, and over 10 million have been infected. But what are the ramifications of this pandemic on our politics, on the world order, and on our nation's role in the free world? In the midst of this pandemic, more Americans voted in the November presidential elections than ever before in our history. We celebrate this commitment by the American people to democratic principles. Although former Vice President Joe Biden was declared the winner of the elections, President Trump has yet to concede. In fact, he believes he won the election. What are the consequences of this ongoing dispute on our democratic system and our standing in the world? The foreign policy challenges the new administration will face are daunting. Will the new administration choose to avoid a new Cold War with China or Russia? And will it skillfully manage our conflicts and disagreements with those two countries? Will the new administration choose to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord? And will the incoming administration ease the maximum pressure policy towards Iran and try to return to the nuclear deal that was negotiated with 7 global powers back in 2016? I raise these important questions because they matter to every one of us. The more we can learn about them, the more effectively we can address them and enhance our national interests. Frankly, there are very few experts with the prerequisite qualifications, insight, and wisdom to address these questions. And this evening, we are all lucky to have one of them with us. Our guest tonight is nationally, internationally recognized for his diverse experiences in military, business, media, and the academy. Admiral James Stavridis is an operating executive of the Carlyle Group, following 5 years as the 12th Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. A retired four-star officer of the Navy, he led the NATO alliance and global operations from 2009 to 2013 as Supreme Allied Commander with responsibility for Afghanistan, Libya, the Balkans, Syria, counter-piracy, and cybersecurity. The Admirals also served as commander of U.S. Southern Command with responsibility for all military operations in Latin America from 2006 to 2009. Over his 37 years of service, he earned more than 50 medals, including 28 from foreign nations. He also earned a PhD in international relations and has published 9 books and hundreds of articles in journals. He's a monthly columnist for Time magazine and chief international security analyst for NBC News, and has tens of thousands of followers on social media. And if you haven't seen it, his 2012 TED Talk on global security has close to 1 million views. If you haven't watched it, you really need to. Please join me in giving a warm Tampa USF welcome to Admiral James Stavridis.
Thank you very much, Dean Eisenberg, for a kind introduction. Admiral, thank you very much for accepting my invitation to come to the University of South Florida. I know how busy you are, and I know that you're in high demand. I occasionally see you in Morning Joe, and I say hello to you, but you probably can't see me from far. If you don't mind, the format that we usually follow is that I raise a number of questions, and then occasionally I'm going to challenge you. Even if you're a former admiral and former dean, I give myself the right to challenge you occasionally. And then at the end of the program, we'll have about 30 minutes for questions from our audience. If this is agreeable to you, I'm going to start asking my first question.
Sounds wonderful. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a native Floridian. I was born not too far from where you are, Professor. I was born over in West Palm Beach. My wife is from Jacksonville, and we are currently coming to you from Ponte Vedra Beach near Jacksonville. So wonderful to be with a fellow Floridian, and I do want to particularly thank the dean for his very kind introduction. Hired to be a dean at Tufts, it was controversial to hire a military officer, and the president of Tufts was asked, well, why do you want to hire a military guy to run the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy? And he said, because I always wanted to have one dean who knew how to follow orders, and I was that dean. So it's wonderful to be back in the world of higher education. Thank you for inviting me, and I am ready to go wherever you would like the conversation to go.
All right, thank you very much. Let me start first with the crisis, the public health crisis we have. I do not want to talk about the public health aspect of it, but I want to focus more on the political aspect of it. And I want to start with this following question. In terms of global politics, geopolitics on the global stage, who are the real winners and losers of this pandemic that has killed hundreds of thousands of everywhere? Who are the winners and losers?
Well, let's start with the winner. Clearly, China will come out of the pandemic stronger than they went into it, as follows. Their economy, unlike the other larger economies, is going to experience a so-called V-shaped recovery, as in it went down fast, but it's going up very quickly. Essentially, that's because they have authoritarian tools that they can apply, mandatory mask wearing nationwide, mandatory testing, locking down cities at a moment's notice. We just don't have those tools in Western democracies, for example. So China, under strong leadership, strong as in authoritarian leadership from President Xi, will come out aggressively, They'll come out economically strong, and they have enhanced their reputation, I would say, in many developing countries who look at China, think about that as a model. China will come out a winner. I think that the European Union will come out neutral. They have managed the pandemic reasonably well given the demographics of their particular countries. But as we see now, they're facing a second wave. There'll be protests. But I think overall, the European Union comes out neutral to stronger. And I also want to applaud the leadership of the leader of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen of Germany. I know her well. She was the Minister of Defense of Germany when I was Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Extremely impressive woman. Her wing woman, we would say, is Christine Lagarde, who has taken charge essentially of the finances of the European Union. It's a powerful combination, strong leadership. They'll come out neutral. I think the United States comes out diminished. We have mishandled the virus terribly. It has exacerbated internal challenges here in the United States. We've got work to do if we're going to turn this around, prepare for the next pandemic, and sort of regain some of the stature that I feel we've lost as a result of our mishandling. And then I'll close on the larger emerging markets. So if you will, India, Pakistan, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean by and large. About 3 billion people live in those three zones. Very weak healthcare systems by and large, uneven systems of governance. The good news is very youthful populations. I think they will have to rely to some degree on herd immunity until we can scale up globally and get vaccines moving to them. So, Mohsen, Professor, it's a mixed picture. That's how I see some of the winners and losers, if you will.
I usually teach a course in comparative politics, and one of the major lessons of comparative politics that I share with the students is that if you know one country in detail, you know no country, because it's only when you compare that country to other countries that you understand the meaning, the real meaning of what's going on in that country. With that in mind, from a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being an awful management of the pandemic, 10 being the best, in comparison to China and the European Union, what would you give the United States? Not from public health, but overall.
I give us a 0. Let me modify it. I'll give us a 1. And the only reason I can give us a 1 is because of, despite gross mismanagement in things like coordinating mask wearing, ensuring information is flowing, orchestrating communication, we failed at all of that. I think it's fair to say that we have done something of a good job, not even a good job, but a barely adequate job in ramping up production of personal protective equipment, manufacturing various ventilating devices. And the only reason I can even give us a 1, frankly, Professor, is the courage and the determination of our medical professionals who have inspired me as I watch them. And by the way, I have 2 son-in-laws who are physicians and 1 daughter who is a nurse practitioner. These are real heroes. But from a management perspective, it's been clearly a disaster in every level, 250,000 dead Americans.
Let me now move to another important issue, and that is the presidential election. And as our dean said, Joe Biden is the declared winner of the presidential election, both in terms of electoral college and in terms of popular votes. However, our president has not conceded yet. The question I had, twofold. Number one, what does that do to democratic institutions in this country? What is the impact of a sitting president essentially saying, that American election was stolen from him. And these are his words, not mine. And the second part of the question is, what kind of impact is it going to have in terms of reputation of the United States all over the world as a champion of democracy? We have the oldest democracy in the world. We have talked about promoting democracy to other countries. When they see a sitting president not conceding the election, what does it do? Are you worried about this, or do you think this is something that can easily be taken care of by the next president if it happens to be Mr. Joe Biden?
Well, first of all, I am president, will be currently President-elect Biden. I have 100% certainty that will occur. Secondly, before I answer the question, I just want to make a comment for the audience, which is that I'm a centrist. I'm a registered independent. I'm never affiliated with either political party, which is something many military people do here in the United States. I've always been a registered independent. I'm very proud of that. I was vetted for vice president by Hillary Clinton, one of 6 people actually vetted by the campaign 4 years ago. Subsequently, I was offered a cabinet post by Donald Trump's administration. So I'm a centrist. Here is my view. I think that the president's behavior is reprehensible. It is nonsensical. He exists in a fantasy if he thinks he won the election. He lost by somewhere between 5 and 6 million popular votes. He lost, I think, quite clearly 306 to whatever in the Electoral College, which he defined himself as a landslide 4 years ago. So he lost the election. The question is both a tactical and a strategic one. Tactically, his behavior is hurting the country badly by weakening our national security, by not cooperating with the transition team so they are ready to go on January 20th when they take power in Washington. And they are hurting the country by not working with the medical professionals that President Biden has assembled and putting them together with the medical professionals on the COVID task force. That is a tactical, of the moment kind of mistake. I think, Professor, your question, how does this hurt the United States internationally? I think we can recover from it. And you and I both recall how the reputation of the United States went down extremely after the invasion of Iraq, for example, in the sense that the Bush administration had invaded on false pretenses. We can go back and have that debate, but the point is the United States was able to recover. I think we will be able to recover, and I'll close by saying President Joe Biden, I know very well. I served for him and President Obama for almost 7 years as a 4-star admiral, both as Supreme Allied Commander and as the commander of U.S. Southern Command. I know them both well. I know President-elect Biden. He is calm, steady, resilient. This is a man who has come back from the death of his wife and baby daughter as a young politician, the death by cancer of his oldest son, Beau. He's extraordinarily resilient. And above all, he is someone who believes in the international system. So I think there is every reason to expect we will come back rapidly from this in a Biden administration.
I came to this country as a young teenager, and I was in Berkeley during the anti-Vietnam War movement. And as you remember, Berkeley was the center of the anti-war movement. And I remember that we had really a feeling of anti-establishment in those days. An American society, because of the 55,000 dead Americans in Vietnam, was highly polarized. But frankly, in the 50 years that I've lived in this country, I've never seen America as polarized as it is today. So the question I have for you, with somebody with background in the military, business, and the media, what can each one of us individually do in order to unify the country? What can I do as an educator to put an end to this polarization? Because as Vice President Biden said, President-elect said, we're not enemies, we are opponents. What can we do? What is your recommendation?
Well, first I would say let's keep a sense of history, and very right to raise an era that you and I, my dear professor, are old enough to remember as young men, and that was the 1960s. We were deeply polarized, and I'm not sure, in my own mind at least, that where we are today is actually worse than then. And then in those days, we had riots, we had cities on fire, we had huge protest marches. The country was in a terribly polarized place over Vietnam principally, but also over race. If you go back to other periods in American history, most notably the Civil War, it's pretty hard to argue that we're more polarized today than we were in the 1860s. And even going back to the birth of the Republic, we've been more often than perhaps our mental map tells us, we have been a nation, a people who get very energized on opposite sides of debate. So number one, let's keep perspective. Number two, let us try and focus each other on the idea of service. And what I mean by that is people often say to me, you know, Admiral, you were in the military for, so many years, 37 years. Thank you for your service. That means a lot to me. I appreciate it. But there are so many ways to serve this country that we see every single day. Our military, certainly, our diplomats, our police officers, our firefighters, our emergency medical technicians, our nurses, our doctors, teachers like yourself, even younger teachers in teaching packed classrooms in Central Florida for $37,000 a year. Do you think all those people are serving the country? I do. So I think we need to encourage a culture of service because service is bipartisan. It's nonpartisan. We ought to thank each other for service as we find it. Number three, education, and you mentioned it. And I think education can be as important as thinking about these devices. Let us consider we put this in the hand of a child in the United States on average when they are 10 years old. 10 years old. Do you think we educate them properly to use these devices, to understand whether what they see is accurate or fanciful or fake news or a deep fake or a river of sewage that runs through the internet? We don't educate. We need to do that when children are very young, up to and including our undergraduate students need to understand how to identify, for example, a deep fake video, which is quite easy to do if you know how to look at them. So education, I think, is an important part. And then fourth and finally, Professor, again, I'll drag you back down memory lane. You and I, again, are old enough to remember the last time we had an election with a significant third party. That was H. Ross Perot, who ran against Bush 1 and President Clinton. And they had a debate that you probably remember, I do. And at one point in the debate, H. Ross Perot turned to the camera, just as I'm looking at the camera now, and he said, you, the American people, you're the owners of this country. Start acting like an owner. And what he meant by that was we should all, as voters, try and find candidates that are willing to reach across the aisle, who are willing to heal these divides. And people say, oh no, everyone's polarized. I don't think so. Take a look at the pool of candidates available in a given election. I'll give you an example, 2 governors. Look at the governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker. He's a Republican. He's a Republican governor in the arguably the most liberal state in the country, Massachusetts. How does he do that? He does it by reaching across the aisles. Look at the governor of New Jersey, Phil Murphy, a former Goldman Sachs banker, an ambassador who has become a governor. He's a Democrat, but he reaches across the aisle. He gets to pragmatic win-win outcomes. Those candidates are out there. So I think fourth and finally, as voters, we have a responsibility to stop simply admiring the problem and talking about all this awful polarization. Okay, let's find some candidates who are willing to work across the aisle. And poll after poll shows the American public would welcome those kind of candidates.
One major difference between what happened in the 1960s and 70s and now, and the reason why I'm a little bit in disagreement with you is because in the 60s and 70s, we had a number of small radical organizations, radical groups who were mobilizing students and other elements. And that, along with the civil rights movement, created a lot of noise, but that we did not have the kind of disagreement we see today between members of the same family, one being supporter of Trump, the other being supporter of Biden. They don't even talk to one another. I don't think that was the case during the Vietnam War in the 1960s. Don't forget, despite all the radical organizations fomenting trouble in the 1960s, we still have Richard Nixon winning elections. We still have Republicans winning presidential election. But that is maybe we can discuss that during question and answer.
Yeah,
if you don't mind, yes, please.
One last thought on that. Yeah. First of all, I tell you from my own personal experience and that of many, many friends, in those days over the war in Vietnam, families were arguing. Families were yelling at each other. The young people were angry. The older people said, do your duty, go to Vietnam. So I don't necessarily agree with the premise that everything was fine within families in the 60s. I think we can both agree what is different now, and its significant challenge is the rise of this anger industry driving the hard right and the hard left in their own echo chambers on the internet, on cable news. That did not exist in the 1960s. And there, I would agree with you, we face a harder challenge to overcome the divide because of that new aspect.
Because we're talking about putting an end to polarization. Why don't we agree that we had polarization in the 1960s and 70s? We have polarization in 2020 in America. But which one is more extensive and deeper? I think it is a kind of question that we need at least an hour or so to talk about. So if you don't mind, I'd like to move away from domestic politics and ask you some question about foreign policy challenges the new administration is going to face. And let me start first and foremost with China. Today, Dr. Henry Kissinger has urged President-elect Biden to put China on top of his agenda. And he has warned that if we don't try to improve relations with China, we're going to pay a heavy price. And as you know, Henry Kissinger he knows more about China than I think most people. He is, after all, the one who opened up China with the help of President Nixon, under the leadership of President Nixon. So the question I have with you, do you agree with Dr. Kissinger's assessment that we need to improve relations with China as soon as we can?
I do entirely. And for our listeners, if you want to read one book to begin to understand China, read Henry Kissinger's magisterial volume on China. Point number two, Kissinger said, as usual, way ahead of the curve, about a year ago, he said that we are in the foothills of a Cold War with China, meaning that we are ascending a mountain that will lead us into a real Cold War. And I'm old enough to remember what a Cold War looks like. We're not there yet, but Kissinger's point, as we climb that mountain, we'll see it. And frankly, Cold Wars can turn into hot wars. And for all those reasons, yes, the Biden administration should absolutely put China at the top of the agenda. The question is, what should they do? And I think I'll sketch a quick prescription, which is first, learn more, understand more, read more. My view is China understands us and studies us much more than we understand China and study China. We need to improve our own understanding of China, especially under President Xi. Number two, we need a strategy to deal with China. We do not have one. We've had a very transactional, up and down, erratic approach that runs from hugging President Xi at Mar-a-Lago to slapping tariffs on them to approaching Xi as the election comes in and asking for help. It's been erratic, no semblance of a strategy. So we need to construct a strategy, and to do that, you bring together the very best people, lock them in a room with Henry Kissinger, and let's have a nuanced, thought-out plan that incorporates diplomacy, economics, military deterrence, cyber and cyber security, cultural implications, on and on, public diplomacy, mass communications. All of that needs to be synchronized by the U.S. interagency. And more importantly, and I know you know this, Professor, it needs to be part of a larger international effort. What the Biden administration should, and I believe they will do, is to get this out of a channel of U.S. versus China and try and create a sense of global engagement together to work with China to solve the fundamental disagreements we have, and they are significant. So create a strategy, put all that together. And lastly, I'll close with this. That strategy should be something like this. Confront where you must. Cooperate wherever you can. So confront on preposterous claims to own the entire South China Sea. Confront on outrageous violations of human rights. Confront on cyber intrusions. But let's cooperate where we can. Let's cooperate on climate. Let's cooperate on economics. Let's cooperate on strategic arms limitation talks. Let's cooperate on the Arctic and the High North, where we both have shared interests in opening these trade routes across the top of the world, etc. Confront where you must, cooperate where you can, have a strategy. That would be my prescription.
I think you made an excellent point, and I'm sorry that I'm going to repeat the story that I have shared with the audience before, some of the people who are watching, and that is they asked Henry Kissinger about 3 or 4 years ago, if you have a chance to talk to President Trump about China, what would you tell him? And he said, I would tell him briefly that you need to have a military advisor, Mr. President. You also need to have an economic advisor. It's very important. You also need a diplomat. You also need somebody who can talk about Chinese culture. That is what we don't have. He said, we don't understand China. We don't understand its culture. We don't understand its history. And when you don't understand another country's history and culture, you cannot come out with the right approach to the problems you have with that country. And I think essentially what you were saying is spot on. I completely agree. Now let's away from, yes, please.
Just to add to that excellent observation, China looks at the long term, and I've seen the intelligence. China is assessing and planning and thinking coherently about the 50-year future, the 100-year future, the 200-year future. In the Pentagon, we do high fives when we conclude our 3-year planning horizon, and we congratulate ourselves on our 5-year long-range plan. China plays the long game. When Kissinger and Deng were talking back in the 70s, Kissinger, in a desultory conversation, said to Deng, well, what do you think about the French Revolution? And Deng said, it's too soon to tell. 200 years later, that's perspective and scale and a temporal vision that we don't share, and we ought to understand that about China.
Quickly, let's move away from China and go to Russia. As you know, Russia has been accused of interfering in American elections a few years back. And still, relations between the US and Russia have been pretty good under President Trump. It seems to me that Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, has a different view of Russia. And if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Putin was not one of those people who quickly congratulated Mr. Biden for the electoral victory. With that in mind, how do you think the new administration should deal with the challenge of Russia? Should we try to be a little bit more aggressive, or follow your advice about China? Cooperate with them where we can and confront them when we must.
I think the prescription holds reasonably well for Russia. First and foremost, we need to have a very view of Vladimir Putin. Russia follows a unitary leadership model. It almost always has throughout its history. It admires a strong, aggressive leader. And you need to understand that this gets back to the point about understanding the culture and the history of a country. And you know, when you, as a country, you buy into the idea of an authoritarian leader, you kind of roll the cosmic dice. And sometimes you have a good outcome. You get Peter the Great. And sometimes you have a terrible outcome. You get Ivan the Terrible. Sometimes you get Joseph Stalin, a horrible outcome. But then you get Gorbachev, and you get Glasnost and Perestroika. Those dice have landed on Vladimir Putin. He will be the czar of all the Russians until he dies. Fact. And so we need to understand him and his mentality. And frankly, it is antithetical to the United States of America because of his background as a KGB agent. And I'll conclude with an anecdote about looking into Vladimir Putin's eyes, which I have done, by the way. But more importantly, when President Bush II met with Vladimir Putin, famously, he came away quite taken with Putin. And he said, you know, I looked into his eyes and I saw his soul. He's a man we can do business with. I don't think he got that right. And subsequently, John McCain, one of my heroes, was asked the question, you've met with Putin, you've looked into his eyes, what did you see? And McCain said, I saw 3 letters, KGB. I think McCain got that one right. We need to understand that. No special deals for Vladimir Putin. I think President Trump had an inclination to give Putin a lot of personal leeway. Big mistake. Putin is no friend of the United States. Having said that, like that great book of leadership by Mario Puzo, The Godfather, I always say, don't make the mistake of hating your enemies. It clouds your judgment. So what should we do? Recognize Putin's in charge. Recognize Putin has deep antipathy for us. Confront where we must our elections. Support for a war criminal in Syria. The invasion of Ukraine. Confront where we must. Find zones of cooperation with Russia. We can find them as surely as we can with China. We have no more national interest in a new Cold War with Russia than we do with China. We need to take a measured approach, but with a skeptical eye, particularly toward Vladimir Putin.
Mario Puzo is one of my favorite writers. And as a matter of fact, if you read his, I'm pretty sure you have, when the audience, if they decide to read his book, The Godfather, at the end of that book, he has some recommendations for writers. And those are fantastic recommendations on how to write, what to do, and what not to do. But let's move away from Russia now and go to Europe, where I know you have quite a bit of experience. President Trump's policy of America first and his policy of undermining international institutions have created a major friction between West Europeans and the United States. As a matter of fact, the leaders of France and Germany and England immediately congratulated Mr. Biden. They just wanted to make sure that there is a new administration. They were sending a subtle signal. So the relationship, you would agree with me, is not the best it has ever been. What can the new administration do, and what is the single greatest challenge the United States is facing in order to restore the Atlantic Alliance?
Well, let's start with elect Biden. When I was Supreme Allied Commander, he came fairly often to Europe and often to NATO. And at one point, we hosted a dinner party for him with the foreign minister and ambassador of the 28 nations of NATO. And then Vice President Biden, Professor, was able to go around the room, and to each of these diplomats in the room, he was able to tell a little story about his time in their country, mention the prime minister or the president of that nation and an interaction he had had, draw on his decades of experience, both as vice president and as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and above all, on his own humanity. He was able to really connect with the people in that room. It really was a bravura performance, I thought. And you can't do that memorizing talking points. You do that based on your life and your experience. So I think, to begin with, President Biden, when he becomes president, will have a very open door and a very welcome door in Europe. Number two, he will bring in the most experienced team that I think any president has brought in, going back to John F. Kennedy. Highly experienced, all of the people he's bringing in the zone of international relations, foreign affairs, national security, cyber security, diplomacy, intelligence. All of them have been either cabinet or just below cabinet level officials. So a steady team that is well known in Europe will help us very much. Number three, stop yelling at the Europeans and just start listening a little bit more. There's been too much angry, negative energy projected at Europe. You reap what you sow in this life. And I think that we should gently and behind closed doors criticize our European allies for not meeting the minimum level of spending stipulated by common agreement in NATO, 2% of GDP. But that should be done quietly and with steady pressure behind closed doors. You know, you commend people in public, you criticize in private. So simply changing the tone, sending an experienced team, employing the president himself, President-elect Biden, I think all those things will help. And I'll close by saying, I think a good practical thing we could do is work on a transatlantic trade agreement. We foolishly walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the Pacific at the end of the Obama administration. That moved on without us. Now we see China has created a new massive free trade zone, the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership. Let's try and do something similar with our European partners, something very practical that we can work on together, particularly as Brexit finally stumbles across the finish line. Now would be a good time to strike an agreement with this European Union economy, which, by the way, collectively is the largest economy in the world, larger than ours, larger than China's. So there would be a set of starting points.
Let's move away from the European Union and Europe and go to the Middle East, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And I have three questions. Let me start with the easiest one. And that would be about U.S.-Israel relations. It is the easiest one because we all know that the relationship between Israel and the United States is deep and it's strategic, and there could be ups and downs, but the essential, the foundation of the relationship is extremely strong, regardless of who is the prime minister in Israel or who the president is in Washington. That said, though, we do have some problems in the Middle East. Do you think that the new Biden administration is going to make drastic changes or some changes in terms of U.S. relations with Israel as it pertains to the Palestinian issue? And if so, what do you think they need to focus on?
I do not think there will be. Just let me preface by saying I know Israel extremely well. I went there for the first time in 1979. I've been many, many times. And when I was the commander of U.S. European Command, perhaps surprising to the audience, part of the responsibility is military-to-military relations with Israel. So I went to Israel constantly for 4 years. I'm very close with co-prime minister, former General Benny Gantz, very close with Secretary or Minister of Foreign Affairs Gabi Ashkenazi, also a former head of the Israeli Defense Forces. I know Israel very well. You are correct, Professor. The relationship is profound and deep. That's not going to change. I think there will be some movement to encourage the Israelis to be somewhat more accommodating to the Palestinians. But frankly, the Palestinians need to understand that their time as the center of the equation in the Middle East is over. And if I were advising the Palestinians, I would say, get your competing houses together, as in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Create a concerted position, get the best deal you can. The Biden administration, I think, will be somewhat more attuned to Palestinian needs, but there's not going to be a sudden shift and a sudden bow wave of support for the Palestinians. The relationship between U.S. and Israel will continue, I think, very strong under President Biden.
My last two questions are about Saudi Arabia and Iran. Let me start with the Saudi Arabia case. Again, the relationship between President Trump and Saudi Arabia, especially between Mr. Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, has been very close. You will recall that President Trump made his first foreign trip to Saudi Arabia. That said, we know that President-elect Biden does not feel the same way toward Saudi Arabia, the way that President Trump does. So do you think there is going to be some changes in terms of U.S.-Saudi relations? And if so, where do you see those changes, the direction of those changes?
I think there will be changes, particularly more of a focus on Saudi military activity, notably in Yemen, which has been poorly run at every level, and allegations of human rights violations. Some U.S. support was provided, both intelligence and logistics, as well as arms sales. I think all that will come under a great deal of scrutiny. In terms of the extremely unfortunate killing, the execution of Jamal Khashoggi, I think there'll be a continuing demand for complete accountability on that particular incident, for example. I think, however, the United States will encourage the gradually warming relations between Israel and the Sunni Arab world. As you know very well, Professor, for decades, Israel has had an amicable relationship with Egypt and with Jordan. That's now expanded. I think we should give the Trump administration some credit for this, bringing in the United Arab Emirates, working to get Bahrain into this, over time. Sudan, I think, perhaps next. There may be more, and eventually bringing together Sunni Arab, Gulf Arabs led by Saudi Arabia, working with Israel. I think that policy will continue. And however, the personal atmospherics, the very warm friendship you allude to between the Crown Prince, whom I've met several times, and he is a very charismatic and very capable figure. He will not enjoy that kind of access, certainly not initially with the Biden administration. So it'll be more tempered and balanced, but I think the big strategic muscle movement in the Middle East is going to be growing alignment between Israel, the Sunni Arabs. The administration will encourage that.
For those of you who are in the audience and you have questions, please go to the chat icon, send your questions, and I will read them as soon as I get them. And I've been looking at my cell phone, not to read the latest news, but to get the questions from the audience. The last question I have for you, Admiral, is about the U.S.-Iran relations. We had a nuclear deal about 6 years ago. It was not a perfect deal, but it was the best deal we could have had at that time. There is no such a thing, as you know better than anyone else. There is no such a thing as a perfect agreement, especially when it comes to weapons and to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. President Trump believed that that treaty, that agreement, was not good enough, and therefore he got out of the agreement. He said he can force the Iranians to come to the negotiating table and that he can have a better deal than Obama did. Well, as everybody knows, that did not happen. And Iran has started enriching uranium way beyond what is allowable under the nuclear agreement. Iranian activities in the region has not changed. In fact, if anything, Iran has even gained some in the region. So the question I have for you in retrospect, do you think getting out of the nuclear deal was a strategic blunder by the US? And the second part of the question, what do you think the new administration, the Biden administration, would do to restore relations, not relations, but to restore the nuclear agreement, to revive the nuclear agreement?
I was a reluctant supporter of the deal when it was struck for the reasons that you say. I felt it was pragmatic, and I also felt that the underlying theory of the deal was to bring Iran more into the community of nations. By doing that, you would encourage the more youthful part of the population. You probably had a better chance over time of seeing change in Iran in positive ways with that deal in place. At this point, I think it is unproductive to litigate the deal. Whether it was a good deal or a bad deal, it's a dead deal. That's just the facts. So the question is, what do we do going forward? I think what the Biden administration will do is not immediately come into office and simply rejoin that deal. What I do think they will do is take counsel with our European allies who have been strongly urging us to continue in the deal and see if we can construct an approach on Iran where we say, look, we need to reset. Let's go back to a negotiation. Let's use the old deal as a framework. But you, Iran, probably have some things you'd like to see different. We have some things we'd like to do differently. Perhaps some kind of limitation on ballistic missile production and technology. Perhaps a limitation on Iranian activity. Let's come back and try and use the old deal as a baseline, but extend it. And if you do that, Iran will lift some sanctions right now and then put in the bank further sanction relief as we get through, shall we say, some gates in negotiating the agreement. Here we get into fairly technical discussions about how to space all that out. But I think the bottom line is we should approach Iran with an attitude that says, let's have a deal. Let us not end up in a situation where we're crushing your economy and you think we're trying to change the regime, which I think is unproductive. And at the same time, you have some things you're doing that we have difficulty with. Let's try and construct a new agreement using the bones of the previous one. I think that's probably something that could happen. And if we started by providing Iran some minimal and basic sanctions relief as a confidence building measure, I think we would have an opportunity to begin a conversation with Iran. That's how I think this plays out. But we won't know more until after January 20th.
Absolutely. Admiral, I have been having conversations with at least 35 to 40 prominent Americans, including a lot of military guys and scholars and writers, authors, etc. And I have to tell you that the clarity of your thinking has struck me. You not only are quite knowledgeable, you're very articulate, but even more important than both of these, you know how to get to the heart of the matter. And you do it very quickly. That is a gift. That is a talent that you have. And I want to tell you, it has been a great pleasure for me to listen to you and to appreciate your wisdom and knowledge. You have combined the two, and I understand now why you are so well received by Americans and by others in Europe and the Middle East and all over. It has been a great pleasure to talk to you. If you don't mind, I'm going to start asking some questions from the questions I have received from the audience. The first question comes from Dr. Scott Solomon, who is the chair of the department or the school that I belong to, the School of Interdisciplinary and Global Studies at the University of South Florida. And he said that he wants to know what you think about the peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia, brokered by Russia and Turkey. Does the lack of U.S. involvement suggest anything about our standing?
I think the agreement, first of all, we should all be happy. Thousands have died in this war. And remember, these are two very small nations. The population of Armenia, which I've visited many times, is only around 3 million. Azerbaijan, I think, is around 5 million, maybe slightly more. These are two very small nations who collectively have lost thousands and thousands killed in this fighting. So number one, let's applaud the fact that at least no bullets are flying. It is a clear defeat for the Armenian side. They have lost a significant chunk of territory, both that they held, that they had taken from the Azeris, but also ethnically Armenian regions. So you see real disruption in the internal politics of Armenia at the moment. As most of the audience will know, this was brokered by the Russians with the Turks coming into the picture. And I think, frankly, it's worth saying, and I agree with the presumption of the question, if the United States were in a position, as we would normally be, to engage, I think we could have had a more even-handed outcome. This is clearly a defeat for the Armenian side. And I believe this is not going to be the end of hostilities, to say the least, in the region. The best we can hope for is that this frozen conflict refreezes, that there's no further bloodshed, and perhaps over time the two sides can be brought together. It is not a promising situation.
I have another question from Judge Raymond Gross, who is the chair of the advisory board we have at the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies. And his question is, what does the Admiral see at the top levels of the Biden administration at defense and state? And will you serve if asked?
Well, Your Honor, that is a very kind question. I would never turn down the opportunity to serve the country for the right administration. And I think I'm in a loose conversation. Stay tuned. I would say that the good news here is that, as I alluded to earlier, President Biden has a superb group, highly experienced around him. Tony Blinken, Michelle Flournoy, Avril Haines, Mike Morrell, Nick Burns, Bill Burns. I could go on and on. These are extraordinary people, deeply experienced, and most importantly, they're a collegial group who have worked together. If I get the call to go in and serve with them, I'd be honored to be part of that team. If not, I will strongly support their effort.
I have another question from Mr. Yusuf Azizi, who I think is in New York. And his question is, with all failures of US policy in the Middle East and acknowledging the new reality of power in that region, don't you think US should reevaluate, reassess its interests and its allies in the region?
First of all, there is deep Middle East fatigue in the United States of America. That is a fact. And it stems from policy failures, tactical reversals, thousands of Americans killed, trillions of dollars spent with little to show for it. So that Middle East fatigue is real. We need to fight that. We should not simply write off this region of the world any more than for 30 years we wrote off Vietnam and walked away from it. Today we have a vibrant relationship with Vietnam. I have visited Vietnam multiple occasions, yet my father fought there as a Marine Corps officer. The Middle East is home to hundreds of millions of people. It is a part of the world that is complex and difficult, but it would be a geopolitical mistake for the United States to simply walk away from the region. My prescription, as you've heard from me tonight, would be build on the strong relationships we already have with Israel, with the Sunni Arab world, try and reach an accommodation of some kind with Iran, be a balance in the region to exterior actors such as Russia and Turkey, who are pushing into the region and I think will not serve the region well. So my view is remain engaged despite the frustration and the recent reversals. It's a part of the world that is too important to simply walk away from.
I have a question from somebody that you probably know. Not probably, I know you know, because he's the one who introduced you to me about 4 or 5 years ago, John from our university. He's asking, what can the US and its allies do to counter the influence China has achieved with its one road, one belt policy?
Well, first of all, John, my very good friend and classmate, I mean, we're both proud graduates of the class of 1976, also known as 1.2 million years ago. John, good to see you. Thank you for being part of this tonight. One Belt, One Road, China's strategy. It's a clever strategy. It has a land component across the old Marco Polo Silk Road. It has a maritime component, flows through the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean. The idea is to export finished goods to Africa, Europe, and to import raw materials. It's a clever, well thought out strategy. One Belt, One Road. It has one problem. The problem is India. India is parked right in the middle of it. What the United States should do is draw closer to India, work with India, a fellow democracy, a nation that will surpass China in population. Its demographics are very good, very impressive as opposed to those of China. China will grow old before it grows rich. India is a young, vibrant democracy. A lot of problems right now. Over time, I would bet on India as a significant factor in the geopolitics of this 21st century. So to counter One Belt, One Road, draw closer and work with India. Number two, work with the nations individually along this One Belt, One Road. Try and compete with China in humanitarian operations, medical diplomacy, public diplomacy, all the traditional tools of soft power. We know how to do that. We are better at that than China is, frankly. We need to exercise those muscles and work with the nations along that path wherever we can. And then third and finally, perhaps most controversially, we should work with China. We should say to China, okay, you have interest in this region. Let's work together. For example, let's manufacture pandemic relief efforts together and work there. I think by working alongside China, where appropriate, there is real money to be made in reducing the allure of China that is emerging as part of One Belt, One Road, and China's frankly very successful treatment of the pandemic. So there's three quick things. John, again, thank you for bringing me here into this group. Professor, I think we've got time for another question or two.
Yes. The question is from one of our PhD students, Mr. Murray. How will the Biden's election affect the Afghan peace process, which was pushed by Donald Trump? And do you think that the next administration will stay on the course in Afghanistan?
Again, because I know all of these people so well, I'm very confident that they will continue to support the efforts of our chief negotiator, Ambassador Zal Khalilzad, an extraordinary figure, Afghan-American, former ambassador to Iraq, former ambassador to Afghanistan itself, fluent in Dari and Pashto. You know, if he didn't exist, would have to invent him, as the saying goes. He has really moved that peace process. What I worry about is the Trump administration in its final days simply pulling all the U.S. troops out of there. That would be a huge mistake, very disruptive to the process. The Biden administration will want to extract those final troops, but they'll do it in a conditions-based way. They'll continue to support the Afghan government. We don't want to give away all the gains we've made in human rights, life expectancy, the treatment of women, education, medical facilities. We can preserve that at relatively little cost now. I'll close by saying, people say sometimes, we need to get all those troops out of Afghanistan. Here's a news flash. We've already gotten almost all the troops out of Afghanistan. When I commanded that mission for 4 years, we had 150,000 troops there. We're down to 5,000 troops. I mean, we have 50,000 troops in Europe. We have 30,000 troops in North Korea, in South Korea, fortunately. We can certainly keep 5,000 troops in Afghanistan to preserve the chance of a peace agreement. The military supports it. The Biden administration will support it. We can still land a peace agreement there. The real risk is not the Biden administration. The real risk is the end of the Trump administration pulling away. I hope we don't do that.
Admiral, I know that I have exploited you quite a bit, but let me exploit you for 2 more minutes, ask you the last question, and I promise there are a lot of other questions, but I promise this is going to be the last. And after that, we're going to say good night so you can go and rest and have a nice glass of red wine. This question comes from, I believe, California, Mr. Farhad Quddusi. Wouldn't U.S.'s hesitation in joining back to the JCPOA, Iran nuclear deal, encourages Iran to move forward for a strategic partnership with China, which in long run is not in the strategic interest of the US. As you know, there is talk about a strategic agreement between China and Iran, in which China reportedly is going to commit $400 billion of investment in the next 15 years in Iran. So what is your assessment of that possibility?
I think that's a very real possibility. And there are also reports of Iran offering to host Chinese military bases there. China has built its first overseas base not so far away on the Horn of Africa. Staging area would be that Indian Ocean coastline of Iran. I think that's a very real possibility. All the more reason that we should renegotiate the agreement with Iran. Again, I think simply diving back into the previous deal is not realistic in terms of U.S. objectives, but I agree with the thrust of the question that we are going to need a creative approach and one that can, over time, engage with Iran. Again, what we want to avoid is stumbling into a Cold War in which nations are kind of forced to choose sides. That is not a profitable or a sensible structure globally. Well, listen, my dear friend, Professor Mohsen, you complimented me a moment ago. I want to compliment you on your extreme, the way you keep the conversation moving. I find your own story as an individual who was born in Tehran, came to America, has made an extraordinary and successful life here. You are so much what this nation is all about. It's been a pleasure to be in a conversation with you. I honor you and I respect you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you have to make one promise to me, and the promise is that you have to accept my invitation to come back next year, because it has been delightful for me, and I'm pretty sure I speak for the audience, to learn from you and to appreciate your insight and wisdom. Would you make that pledge?
I make that pledge, and we will follow it up with a great dinner downtown in Tampa and a cigar. And I look forward.
Should we invite John to come with us?
We should invite John. Classmate, you are required to come with us.
Thank
it would
you
be
very
my honor and my pleasure.
Wonderful evening, and may God bless you and God bless America.
Same to you, my friend, sir.
Thank you.